Hi everybody, this is John Spritzler. In this video I'm going to give a brief introduction to egalitarianism. What is an egalitarian society? I think that we should make a revolution to remove the rich from power, to start creating an egalitarian society, and this video is to give a brief idea of what the principles are of such a society. So let me start by defining what is an egalitarian. An egalitarian is a person who holds two important values and who thinks society should be shaped by those two values. The first value is equality. Equality in the sense of no rich and no poor, not in the sense of making everyone identical or the same, and not in the sense that everyone gets paid the same amount of money, but in the sense of the principle that the economy should be based on, which is from each according to reasonable ability, to each according to need or reasonable desire. So people contribute according to reasonable ability. That means if they're just a child or above retirement age or physically or mentally incapable of contributing, then their reasonable contribution is zero. But if they're in good health and not otherwise prevented, their reasonable contribution to the economy would be considered reasonable if their fellow, let me put it this way, if the egalitarians in the local community making decisions in the local assembly of egalitarians thinks it's reasonable. It's as simple as that. And so let me go back now. This idea of equality in the sense of no rich and no poor, I've touched on briefly. That's principle number one, or value number one. And the second value, closely related to it, is the value of mutual aid. That's the idea that people should help each other. Very simple. It's the opposite, however, of the idea that prevails in capitalism, which is that we're all put on this planet to compete against each other, to compete to see who will be the winners and who will be the losers. And so among the people who share this value of competition, their only concern is that the world should be a level playing field, that the competition should be fair in the sense that everyone's individual merit is the only thing that determines if you're a winner or a loser, regardless of race or gender or nationality and religion and so forth. But the egalitarian idea is that we're not on this planet to compete against each other. We're on this planet to help each other, to make it a better world for all. Okay. Most people, although they've never heard the word egalitarian before, are egalitarians in most communities on the planet, and including in the United States. Most people would say they agree with these two values of egalitarianism. That might not be true in some very wealthy communities, or maybe even some other non-wealthy communities here and there, but in most communities that's the case. So now we've defined who are the egalitarians, and not everybody is an egalitarian. Some people are anti-egalitarian, people who think that there ought to be some very rich people and some very poor people because, hey, that's fair, winners and losers. Some people think there has to be very rich people because otherwise there wouldn't be any civilization, there'd be none of the good things in life and so forth. Well, people have various reasons for disagreeing with the idea of no rich and no poor. Bill Gates doesn't agree with it. Warren Buffett doesn't agree with it. The Rockefeller family doesn't agree with it. the Walton family that owns Walmart, they don't agree with it, and but most people do. Okay, so let me say something about government in an egalitarian society. First, let me define what I mean by local community. A local community is a community that is about 30 or 40,000 people, although this is not written in stone. But the idea is that it's a community small enough so that when the local assembly of egalitarians is meeting, which is a body that is open to all the egalitarians in the local community to come and participate as equals in making decisions and writing laws for the local community. The local community is small enough so that all the egalitarians who wish to participate in that local assembly could do so physically. They could all fit in the same large room. And those of you who may have gone to conferences in big hotels know that most big hotels that have conferences at them have large conference halls that hold several thousand, many 4, 5, 6,000 people, sometimes more, and allow those people to have a plenary session, which means a session of the whole, and so it's not unreasonable for occasional local assemblies of egalitarians to be as large as several thousands of people, with, of course, smaller committees meeting maybe more frequently that are smaller and so forth. But so when I say local community, I'm thinking, since I live in Boston, the city of Boston has about 10 or 12 neighborhoods with names like Jamaica Plain and Roxbury and the South End and Hyde Park and so forth. And these neighborhoods, in which people have a sense of being in a particular neighborhood, are about 30 or 40,000 in population, and they would be something like what I mean by a local community. Okay, so the government in an egalitarian society works this way. In every local community there is a local assembly of egalitarians, as I said, open to all the egalitarians in the local community. And at this local assembly, the people as equals make the laws and decide what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, and make policies that all the people in the local community have to obey. The local assembly is the government. It is the sovereign power. There is no higher level body of government above it that has lawmaking powers. That's the first element of an egalitarian society. What this means, if you think about it, is that egalitarians in a local community are never required to obey a law that they did not have an opportunity to help write as equals with all the others who wrote it. Egalitarians in a local community are not required to obey a law that was written by a so-called representative who claims the right to essentially be a dictator, to say, the representatives in our present system, they say, well, this is the law, we're writing it, and everyone has to obey it. I don't care if they agree with it or not. So in that sense, there are no politicians. People are not electing representatives to be their dictator the way it is today. Now this raises the question, of course, well, how is large-scale coordination and large-scale social order achieved if every little local community is its own sovereign power? And the answer is by voluntary federation. Local assemblies send delegates to meet with delegates from other local assemblies, and the purpose of these what I call non-local assemblies, assemblies that are composed of delegates from local assemblies. The purpose of the non-local assemblies is not to write laws because they don't have lawmaking power. Their purpose is to craft proposals to be implemented by the local assemblies if they wish to, and not implemented if they don't wish to. And what that means in practice is negotiations and communications back and forth between the non-local assembly that's trying to craft a proposal for a larger region and the local assemblies and their delegates to go back and forth and come up hopefully with proposals that are agreed to by sufficient numbers of local assemblies to actually implement the proposal. And the types of non-local assemblies could vary in many ways. You know, some of them could consist of delegates who are concerned with creating or maintaining a functioning large university or very large economic enterprise, what we think of today as a multinational corporation even, or to organize the Olympics or some big cultural event that would require the participation of many, many local communities to make it happen. The voluntary federation is what I call this process. The local assemblies send delegates to meet with other delegates, and of course they can recall the delegate that they send at any time. But keep in mind that these delegates do not have lawmaking power, so it's not like a local assembly is deciding who's going to be their dictator. They're just sending someone who they hope can play a good and effective role in helping to craft a proposal that the local assembly will decide on its own that it wants to implement. And of course the non-local assemblies that might, at the lower level, might consist of delegates from a relatively small geographical region, maybe think of it as a county in a state, something like that. And these non-local assemblies, in turn, can send delegates to meet with delegates from other such non-local assemblies, and when those delegates meet, they, in a sense, form an assembly that has input from a larger region, and that assembly in turn could send delegates to meet with similar ones from even more distant places, and you can ultimately have a non-local assembly that has input from the entire planet. Now, the degree of coordination and order that can be achieved by voluntary federation is just as much as the degree that can be achieved by the opposite principle, what I call the authoritarian principle, which is the principle we're all used to, which is the idea that somehow you end up with a small body of people who I'll call generically the central government, and the central government makes laws that everybody has to obey no matter what, like the federal government, which consists of a few hundred individuals. They make laws, and everybody, all 300 plus million Americans, have to obey those laws no matter what. That's the authoritarian principle. The principle I'm advocating, the voluntary federation principle, is the principle that the International Postal Service is based on. There's something like 194, I think it is, nations that use voluntary federation to arrive at the coordination that we sort of take for granted today. When you mail a letter or a package to another country, it gets there. I don't hear people up in arms complaining that it's chaos. Football fans in the United States don't generally complain about utter chaos when they go to see a football game, but the National Football League is based on voluntary federation of the individual football teams, and it's a perfectly good way to achieve large-scale order and coordination, but it's far more democratic. The problem with the way we're used to the authoritarian principle is that in the United States, we're all familiar with the problem. Big money, a relative handful of billionaires, has seized control of the federal government because they've been able to bribe or the Congress people and the people in the executive with bribes of one sort or another, including cushy jobs after they finish their term of office if they serve big money. And the lobbyists for the big corporations and so forth control our, quote, representatives, who hardly represent us anymore. And by controlling a few hundred individuals in Congress and the executive branch, they make laws that more than 300 million Americans have to obey. And so the authoritarian principle that we're used to is basically a welcome mat for an oppressive, dominating elite. In our case, the elite is big money, but in a communist country like China, the elite is the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And the Bolsheviks, when they were in power in Russia, was the same idea. People were so used to having to obey the Tsar that when the Bolsheviks replaced the Tsar, they felt they had to obey the Bolsheviks. Well, no, we don't have to obey the central government. Really, we should only have to obey the laws made by the egalitarians in our local community. Now, I keep saying the egalitarians in the local community. You'll notice that I'm not saying that the local assembly is an assembly of everybody in the local community, and there's a reason for that. As I pointed out, not everybody is an egalitarian. Some people are anti-egalitarian. The purpose of egalitarianism is to shape society by egalitarian values, and it is a way of facilitating egalitarians in doing that. But the purpose is not to allow anti-egalitarians to shape society by anti-egalitarian values. And what we need is a government of local assemblies of egalitarians that discuss how to shape society by egalitarian values. We do not want a government to consist of everybody, including anti-egalitarians, in which case the meetings would be about whether or not to shape society by egalitarian or anti-egalitarian values. Well, I'm advocating egalitarian revolution. The people who have decided to shape it by egalitarian values are going to take control, finally, for the first time. So there's a big misunderstanding about democracy. A lot of people believe, because we're taught, that democracy is a form of government in which all the people, as equals in some sense, get to participate, even if just by electing representatives, in resolving their disagreements, in making social decisions that resolve disagreements peaceably, without the use of force or even the threat of force. And that's what we're told is a democracy, that all the people resolve their differences peaceably with no force, with everyone having an equal say in some sense, using some kind of a decision rule. Now, the decision rule that we're used to in the United States and other countries, some other countries, is the idea of majority rule, that you elect representatives, and whatever decision the majority comes to, that's the decision that everyone has to go by. And there are variations on that. Sometimes, in some cases, it's a supermajority that's required, 2/3 vote in some cases, and so forth. But the decision rule in democracies could be different. It could be a consensus is required, or everyone has to agree. Or it could even be that people agree to appoint some kind of a special person with a special title, an arbitrator or what have you, and they agree that whatever that person decides, that's what they'll all agree to do. The point is that the idea that we are taught about democracy is that everyone agrees to accept some kind of a decision rule that enables people to decide peaceably, with no use of force, what the decision is going to be, and then everyone agrees to follow that decision. Well, in a society in which there is what I call a fundamental disagreement, that idea of democracy cannot exist. And if someone claims that it exists, they're lying. And this is why. Let's take an extreme case of a fundamental conflict, which the definition of a fundamental conflict is one in which there's a disagreement and neither side will back down unless forced by actual force or violence or the credible threat of force and violent force. So the question whether there should be slavery or not, that was a fundamental disagreement in U.S. history. And, you know, as everybody knows, we had the trappings of democracy, of supposedly a democracy of all the white people, of all the white men, I guess, to be exact. But even amongst that group of white men, there was a fundamental conflict. The Confederate, the white slave owners in the Confederate States had a fundamental conflict with the white men who in the northern states, and it came out most sharply. And what led to the Civil War actually was that the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a federal law, required the northern states to capture runaway slaves and return them to their slave owners in the South. But lots and lots of people in the northern states were opposed to that and obstructed the implementation of that law with big demonstrations and resistance of various ways. And the southern states, if you look at their documents, their secession documents, they seceded from the Union because the Union was no longer enforcing federal law, namely the Fugitive Slave Act. And so there was a fundamental conflict about whether there should be slavery or not. It was couched in less explicit terms initially, whether simply slavery should be allowed to expand into the new states or not, but it was fundamentally about whether there should be slavery or not. And this conflict could not be resolved peaceably. That's why there was a civil war, in spite of the fact that we had all the mechanisms of resolving conflicts peaceably with the U.S. Constitution. It could only be resolved violently. The slave owners were defeated. It wasn't as total a defeat as it should have been, but on the narrow topic of whether slavery would be legal or not, they were defeated. And they were defeated only by being militarily defeated in a civil war by the application of violent force. So slavery, should there be slavery or not, is an example of a fundamental conflict. And it is absurd to think that there could be a democracy of all the people. Now let's include the slaves among all the people. Imagine someone saying, during the slavery years of the South, in, say, Mississippi, well, let's have a democracy of all the people, the slave owners and the slaves, and we'll decide peaceably whether there should be slavery or not with some decision rule, majority vote or consensus or something, and whichever side wins the decision rule, the other side will go along with it peaceably. Well, that's absurd. The slaves never went along with slavery peaceably, and there's no way they would. And the slave owners never went along with the idea of abolishing slavery peaceably, and there's no way that they would. No decision rule that you could ever dream of would make either side back down voluntarily. Only force, or the credible threat of force prevailing against one side by the other, resolves such an issue. Well, there's a fundamental conflict today, and that conflict is over whether we should have class inequality, whether we should have an upper class with lots and lots of money that, because of its having lots of money, has the lion's share of the power in society and can control the lives of the remaining people, make them work for them as employees, and do with them essentially what they want. We live in a class society, but the lower class never agreed to it voluntarily. People put up with it because they feel that they have no choice, because force, the credible threat of force, is always aimed against them. The police, the military, and so forth. Everyone knows that, if you're fired from your job and you continue to show up to work, well, the police will drag you away if you push the issue. So the moral of this is that it only makes sense to talk about a democracy among people who share fundamental values, in which the disagreements are non-fundamental values. What should be the retirement age? Should we go on red and stop on green, or go on green and stop on red? Is such and such an economic enterprise contributing reasonably or not? These are issues about which people can reach compromises and agreements, or agree to disagree, because it's not considered a fundamental conflict. And so among egalitarians who share these two fundamental egalitarian values of mutual aid and equality, in the sense of no rich and no poor, there will be disagreements, but there can be democracy among egalitarians. But there cannot be democracy that includes egalitarians and anti-egalitarians, and that's why the local assemblies, only egalitarians have the right to participate as equals with other egalitarians in the local assembly. So now let me just jump to the economic structure, which is briefly that local assemblies use voluntary federation to form mutual agreements with other local assemblies, so that local communities in large numbers, possibly millions of them, involving possibly billions of people, if people wish, if people mutually agree, can form a sharing economy with each other, which means that they have mutual agreements about what the different local communities will produce and how they will distribute it to where it needs to be distributed to, and the local communities in the sharing economy agree to share the products and services of the economy this way freely. There's no money involved. So people in the sharing economy can take for free from the economy what they need or reasonably desire. And if at any point a local community decides that another local community or region is not contributing reasonably according to ability, and not, by that I mean that it could mean that they're being lazy, not doing anything, or it could mean that they're working hard but they're producing junk, or they're producing stuff that nobody wants, whatever. Then people could say, we don't want to be in the sharing economy with these people. Either they leave, either they're excluded from it, or we'll leave and be in a smaller sharing economy with people that we do agree to be with. And this is these decisions are ones that people are making all the time, and this is how human beings cooperate with each other, and can make an economy that as the example of Spain in the Spanish Revolution, 1936-9, showed, where half of Spain was essentially functioning this way or very close to it. Economic productivity increased dramatically compared to what was produced under the capitalists before the revolution. So this is a glimpse of what an egalitarian society is like. I think it's one where people will be much happier and much better off in a lot of ways I don't have time to talk about here. I guess I should touch on the idea of private property. In an egalitarian society, people have private property. Yes, people own private property, but they own private property that is reasonable to own, which is property that they can use or enjoy personally or as a family. A house, a boat, land for a garden, so forth. But what people cannot own is property that it's not reasonable for an individual or just a family to own, like, for instance, a vast tract of land that either could be used for recreation by lots of people, or could be used for agriculture, but it would require lots and lots of people working on it, not just the family or individual that claims to own it. It's reasonable for a person or family to own their home, but it's not reasonable for them to own a bunch of tenement buildings that other people would live in. And so, yes, there's private property, but it's reasonable ownership of private property, not unreasonable. Okay, I just want to finish by saying that I've written some books about this, which are on Amazon. No Rich and No Poor, and Divide and Rule. And the first is about what an egalitarian society is and how we can actually win it, how we can remove the rich from power. And the second one is how we can create the unity that we need to make an egalitarian revolution by overcoming the enormous divisions that the ruling class has created amongst us, most of them in the framework of the left versus the right. And so I urge you to go on Amazon and get my books and read them. They're both Kindle and paperback versions. Okay, one last note is that this video is sort of replacing an earlier one that's an introduction to the same ideas, where the volume was unfortunately too low because of a technical glitch. So apologies for the earlier version not being easy to listen to. Okay, goodbye.